When the billionaire pointed at the dirty little boy and shouted that challenge in front of everyone, no one expected what would happen next. The silence that fell over that ballroom would change 2 lives forever. The crystal chandeliers poured golden light over the grand ballroom of the Harrington estate. Each piece of that magnificent fixture had been imported from Venice, assembled by artisans who charged a small fortune just for their labor. French champagne glasses clinked between rehearsed laughter and conversations about billion-dollar deals. Women in gowns that cost more than most people earn in a year floated between imported sculptures and paintings worth small fortunes. It was the charity gala of the season, the winter celebration hosted by Harrington Holdings, where the elite of Greenwich, Connecticut, gathered to pretend they cared about the less fortunate while spending more on a single bottle of wine than many families spent on groceries in a month. At the center of everything, imposing like a rare jewel, rested a grand piano, a Steinway Model D Black, gleaming, untouched. No one dared approach it. The guests knew that instrument carried a story no one mentioned in the presence of the master of the house. Victor Harrington moved among his guests with the posture of a king in his castle. At 58 years old, he had silver hair slicked back, an Italian suit cut to perfection, and eyes so cold they could make any employee tremble. He had built his empire from nothing, the business magazines said. What they never mentioned was how many people he had crushed along the way, how many families lost everything so he could gain more, how many dreams turned to ash so his could shine. But there was something else behind that icy exterior, something broken, something that had shattered 7 years ago when Margaret, his wife, took her last breath in the bedroom upstairs. She had been everything he was not. Warm where he was cold, generous where he was selfish, kind where he was cruel. And when she died, whatever humanity remained in Victor Harrington seemed to die with her. The piano had been hers. She used to play every evening before dinner. Chopin, Debussy, sometimes pieces no one recognized. Compositions that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her soul. Victor would sit in his leather chair, pretending to read the newspaper, secretly listening to every note. It was the only time he ever felt at peace. After her funeral, he ordered the piano moved to the ballroom, not to be played, never to be played again. A monument to everything he had lost. Anyone who touched it faced immediate dismissal. Tonight, Victor wanted everyone to know exactly how powerful he was. And everyone did. That is why they were there, smiling, flattering, pretending to admire a man they secretly despised. The party followed its perfect script. White-gloved waiters served sophisticated canapés. A string quartet played softly in the corner. Business executives praised Victor, hoping for some crumb from his table. Everything absolutely controlled, until something broke that rehearsed perfection. His side door opened slowly. First, a small hand appeared, pushing against the heavy wood. Then a face emerged through the crack. Enormous eyes, brown, frightened, disheveled hair falling over a sweaty forehead. Elijah was 9 years old, but looked younger. Life had been too hard too soon. He wore a t-shirt that had once been white, now grimy with a tear at the shoulder. His jeans had patches on the knees. His sneakers were so worn that the sole was coming loose at the front, opening like a mouth with each step. He was looking for his mother. Sarah worked somewhere in that mansion tonight, hired as extra cleaning staff for the gala. They had promised good pay, and she desperately needed that money. The rent was overdue, the electricity bill too, and the medications were the worst. They cost more than she earned in 2 weeks of work. But without them, the chest pains became unbearable. Sarah pretended she was fine. She always pretended. But Elijah saw. He saw when she leaned against the wall, thinking no one was watching. He saw when she closed her eyes and breathed deep, trying to make the dizziness pass. He saw when she cried softly at night, thinking her son was asleep. Her shift was taking too long, and Elijah grew worried. His mother had not been well. She had fainted twice in the past week. The first time while washing clothes, the second while cooking dinner. Elijah had to turn off the stove himself, terrified the house would catch fire while he shook his mother, trying to wake her. So he did what any worried son would do. He left the back room where he was supposed to wait and went to find her. The problem was that he entered through the wrong door. Elijah took 3 steps into the ballroom before realizing where he was. His eyes widened at such wealth. He had never seen anything like it. The chandeliers looked like waterfalls of diamonds. The floor was so polished he could see his own reflection. And those people, they all looked at him as if he were an insect, that had invaded a garden of rare flowers. The silence spread like a wave. Conversations died one by one. The laughter stopped. The string quartet ceased playing when they noticed no one was paying attention anymore. All eyes turned to the poor boy standing in the middle of the ballroom. Elijah felt his face burn. He wanted to run, but his legs would not obey. He stood paralyzed like a rabbit caught in headlights. A woman in a red dress covered her mouth, disgusted. A man with a mustache wrinkled his nose as if he smelled something foul. Whispers began circulating. Who let this in? Where did this kid come from? Victor Harrington turned to see what had interrupted his perfect party. When his eyes found Elijah, something crossed his face. It was not compassion. It was irritation, as if a stain had appeared on his new shirt. He walked toward the boy. His Italian shoes made a firm sound against the marble floor. Each step seemed like thunder in the silence of the ballroom. Elijah tried to step back but tripped over his own feet. He almost fell. Some people laughed. Victor stopped 6 feet from him, looked him up and down, analyzing every detail of that miserable figure. The dirty clothes, the destroyed sneakers, the grimy fingernails. "Who are you?" Victor's voice cut through the air like a blade. Elijah swallowed hard. His voice came out thin, trembling. Sorry, sir. I'm looking for my mum. She works here. Sarah. Sarah Thompson." "The cleaning lady?" Elijah nodded, ashamed. Victor let out a short laugh, devoid of any warmth. "So the cleaning lady's son decided to take a stroll through my party." He turned to the guests, spreading his arms theatrically. "Look at this, ladies and gentlemen. We have a surprise guest." Laughter echoed through the ballroom. Elijah felt his eyes sting, but he held back the tears. He had promised himself he would not cry, not in front of these people. From the back of the room, a woman's voice cut through the mockery. "Victor, that is enough." The crowd parted slightly. Eleanor Whitmore, 72 years old, widow of Judge Robert Whitmore, walked forward with the dignity of someone who had seen too much of life to be impressed by wealth. "Eleanor," Victor said, his smile not reaching his eyes, "always the humanitarian. And you, always the disappointment." She stopped beside Elijah, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This child is looking for his mother. Perhaps instead of making a spectacle, you could simply help him find her." A few uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the crowd. No one spoke to Victor Harrington that way. No one except Eleanor Whitmore. Victor's jaw tightened. "This is my house, Eleanor, my party, and this," he gestured at Elijah, "is trespassing. He is a child. He is an intruder." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "Be careful who you humiliate, Victor. Life has a way of teaching lessons to those who refuse to learn them gently." Victor ignored her warning. His attention had shifted to something else. He had noticed how Elijah's eyes kept drifting to the piano, the Steinway, Margaret's piano. Something cruel passed through Victor's expression. An idea, a way to turn this embarrassing moment into entertainment for his guests. He snapped his fingers and pointed at Elijah. "Hey, kid, you like my piano?" Elijah finally tore his gaze from the instrument to look at the man. It's very beautiful, sir." "Beautiful?" Victor walked to the piano and ran his hand over the gleaming surface. "This piano cost more than you and your entire family will ever see in your lives. It is a Steinway Model D, handcrafted in Germany." Elijah did not know what to say. He just stood there, looking. Victor turned to the guests with a predatory smile. "You know what? I am going to make a proposal to our young visitor." He looked back at Elijah, his eyes glinting with malice. "Kid, do you know how to play piano?" Elijah hesitated. His mind flew to his grandfather, to the afternoons in the houses of the wealthy where Grandpa Thomas tuned pianos for a living, to the stolen moments when small fingers touched forbidden keys while his grandfather watched the door. "A little," Elijah murmured. Victor burst out laughing. A woman nearby, draped in diamonds, laughed along. The guests followed the chorus of mockery. "A little," Victor repeated, wiping an imaginary tear from his eye. "The cleaning lady's son knows how to play a little piano. This is priceless." The billionaire then approached Elijah, got so close the boy could smell the expensive cologne mixed with champagne. "Tell you what, kid, I will make you a deal." Victor's voice dropped, but it was loud enough for everyone to hear. "If you can sit at that piano and play something, anything, that does not make my ears bleed, I will give you $10 million. Gasps rippled through the crowd. $10 million. Even for these people, that was an absurd sum. "Victor, this is cruel. Eleanor said, her voice hard. It is generous, Victor countered. More money than this kid's family will ever dream of. All he has to do is play. He leaned down until his face was level with Elijah's. What do you say, boy? $10 million. Right here. Right now. If you can play that piano. The crowd waited. Some smirked, anticipating the humiliation. Others looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. He thought of his mother, somewhere in this house working her fingers raw for pennies. He thought of the unpaid bills on the kitchen table. He thought of the medicine bottles that were almost empty. And he thought of his grandfather, the man who had taught him everything, who had died poor and forgotten but whose hands had created magic on ivory keys. The music does not belong to the rich, my grandson, Thomas used to say. It belongs to anyone with a soul to feel it. Elijah looked up at Victor Harrington. Okay? Victor blinked, surprised. He had expected tears, refusal. Maybe the kid would run away. He had not expected acceptance. I am sorry, what? I said okay. Elijah's voice was small but steady. I will play. More laughter from the crowd. This was going to be entertaining. Victor stepped aside with a mocking bow. By all means. The stage is yours. Elijah walked toward the piano. His worn sneakers made soft sounds against the marble. Each step felt like a mile. He could feel hundreds of eyes on his back, waiting for him to fail. Eleanor watched with her hand pressed to her heart. Something about this boy reminded her of someone she had known long ago. Elijah reached the piano. He ran his fingers along the edge of the bench, feeling the smooth wood. Then he looked back at Victor. Can I really sit here? By all means. Victor's smile was sharp as a knife. Let us hear what the cleaning lady's son can do. Elijah pulled out the bench and sat down. His feet barely reached the pedals. His hands looked impossibly small against the vast expanse of black and white keys. The crowd pressed closer. Someone pulled out a phone to record the expected humiliation. Victor crossed his arms, waiting for the inevitable disaster. But Eleanor noticed something. As Elijah placed his hands on the keys, a change came over him. The fear melted from his face. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing slowed. It was as if another person had entered that small, battered body. Elijah closed his eyes. He thought of his grandfather, of stolen afternoons and whispered lessons, of a promise made beside a hospital bed. Never stop playing, Elijah. No matter what happens, promise me. I promise, Grandpa. His fingers found their positions on the ivory, and in the breathless silence of that ballroom full of millionaires, the cleaning lady's son began to play. The first note cut through the ballroom like a blade of light through darkness. It was a single sound, pure, clear, perfect. The smirks on people's faces froze. The woman who had been lifting her phone to record lowered it slightly. Victor Harrington's mocking smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. Then came the second note, and the third, and suddenly, the music was not just notes anymore. It was something alive, something breathing, something that wrapped around every person in that room and refused to let go. Elijah's small fingers moved across the keys with a certainty that seemed impossible for a child his age. His eyes remained closed, his face peaceful, as if he had left that hostile ballroom and traveled somewhere far away, somewhere safe, somewhere filled with love. The melody was haunting. Delicate. It started soft like a whisper shared between old friends, then grew stronger, building like waves approaching a shore. There was sadness in it, yes, but also hope, a bittersweet beauty that made your chest ache in the most exquisite way. One by one, the expressions in the room began to change. The woman in the red dress who had covered her mouth in disgust now pressed her hand to her heart instead. The man with the mustache who had wrinkled his nose stood perfectly still, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. A waiter carrying a silver tray stopped in his tracks, tears forming in his eyes before he even understood why. But it was Victor Harrington's reaction that would have shocked anyone paying attention. The color had drained from his face. His crossed arms had fallen to his sides. His lips parted slightly, and his breathing became shallow, uneven. He knew this music. He knew every note, every pause, every breath of this composition. He had heard it 1,000 times, 10,000 times, in the evenings when the sunset painted their bedroom gold, in the mornings when he would find Margaret already at the piano, still in her nightgown, playing before the rest of the world woke up, in the final weeks when her fingers had grown too weak to play, and she would hum the melody instead while he held her hand. This was her song, The piece she loved above all others, the composition she called her soul, translated into sound. But how? How could this ragged child know Margaret's favorite piece? It had never been published, never recorded. It existed only in Margaret's memory, and in the silence she left behind. Victor's mind raced backward through time, pulling him away from the present and into the past he had tried so hard to bury. 35 years ago, a 17-year-old Margaret sat at a piano much smaller than the Steinway. It was in a modest studio apartment, surrounded by stacks of sheet music and the smell of coffee brewing in a tiny kitchen. Her teacher stood beside her, Thomas Bennett, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and hands that had seen decades of ivory keys. He was not famous, never would be, but Margaret believed he was the most gifted pianist she had ever encountered. "Play it again," Thomas said gently. "But this time do not think about the notes. Think about what you want to say." "What if I do not have anything to say?" young Margaret asked. Thomas smiled. "Everyone has something to say, child. The piano simply helps us find the words we cannot speak." Margaret played the piece again, a composition Thomas had written himself. He called it Song for Margaret, a graduation gift for his most talented student. "This is yours now," he told her when she finished. "Wherever life takes you, this music will remind you of who you truly are. Not the masks we wear for the world, the person underneath." Margaret had embraced her teacher and promised to never forget him. But life, as it often does, had other plans. She met Victor at a charity event the following year. He was young then, hungry, building his empire one ruthless deal at a time. She saw something in him that others missed, a wounded boy hiding behind a wall of ambition. She believed she could heal him. They married quickly. She abandoned her dreams of becoming a concert pianist to support his career. Years passed, decades. She never stopped playing, but only at home, only for herself and Victor. And always, she returned to Thomas's composition, her song, her truth. She had tried to find Thomas once, about 15 years ago, wanted to thank him, wanted to help him if he needed it, but he had vanished. No forwarding address, no phone number. It was as if he had simply faded from the world. Margaret made Victor promise. In her final days, when speaking became difficult and breathing became a battle, she wrote it in her shaking hand. "Find Thomas Bennett. Thank him for me. Help him if you can." Victor had promised. He had held her hand and promised with tears streaming down his face, and then she died, and he buried that promise along with her. The music continued to pour from the Steinway, pulling Victor back to the present, back to the impossible reality of a 9-year-old boy in torn clothes, playing his dead wife's favorite composition as if he had known it his entire life. Victor's legs felt weak. He reached out and gripped the back of a nearby chair to steady himself. Eleanor Whitmore noticed. She had been watching Victor since the first notes, and what she saw frightened her. The most powerful man in the room looked like he had seen a ghost. Elijah played on, oblivious to the storm he was creating. In his mind, he was not in a ballroom surrounded by strangers. He was in his grandfather's tiny apartment, sitting on a bench made from old wooden crates, playing on a keyboard missing half its keys. "That is it, Elijah," Grandpa Thomas would say, his weathered hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "Feel the music. Let it tell you where to go." "Grandpa, why do you never play at concerts like the pianists on TV?" Thomas would smile, but there was always sadness hiding in the corners of that smile. "Some musicians play for the world, little one. Others play for the people they love. I was never meant for stages and spotlights. I was meant for this, for you, for moments that no audience will ever see but that matter more than any standing ovation. Will you teach me all the songs you know? I will teach you everything, Elijah. Every note, every secret, every story these keys can tell." And he did. In stolen afternoons, while Thomas tuned pianos in wealthy homes, he would let Elijah practice on instruments worth more than everything they owned. In evening hours, when the rest of the world watched television, grandfather and grandson would sit together at their broken keyboard, creating magic from nothing. Thomas taught Elijah hundreds of songs, classical masterpieces, jazz standards, folk melodies from countries they would never visit. But there was one composition he saved until the very end. "This song," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion, "I wrote for someone very special, a student I had many years ago. She had a gift, Elijah, a light inside her that came out through her fingers when she played. I have never seen anyone play with such soul." "What happened to her?" Thomas looked out the window at the grey city skyline. She went on to live her life, as we all must. I do not know where she is now, but I like to think she still plays. I like to think that somewhere this music is still alive. He turned back to Elijah with tears glistening in his eyes. Learn this one perfectly. And if you ever have a chance to play it for someone who needs to hear it, promise me you will. I promise, Grandpa. 2 years later, Thomas Bennett died in his sleep, peacefully, quietly, the way he had lived his entire life. He left behind no money, no possessions of value, just a broken keyboard, a box of yellowed sheet music, and a grandson who carried his legacy in 10 small fingers. The final notes of the composition faded into silence. For 3 heartbeats no one moved, no one breathed. The ballroom had transformed into something sacred, a cathedral of shared emotion where titles and bank accounts meant nothing. Then Eleanor Whitmore began to clap, slowly at first, one pair of hands breaking the spell. Then another guest joined, and another. Within moments, the entire room erupted in applause. Real applause, not polite acknowledgement for a mediocre performance. This was the sound of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Some wiped tears from their cheeks without shame. Others looked at the boy with newfound respect, perhaps seeing for the first time that talent and worth were not distributed according to zip codes. But Victor did not clap. He stood frozen, his knuckles white against the chair he still gripped. His face was wet, and he did not even realize when the tears had started falling. 7 years. 7 years since he had last cried. Since Margaret's funeral, when he had sworn to seal away every emotion that made him vulnerable. This child had shattered that seal in 4 minutes. Elijah opened his eyes, blinking as if waking from a dream. The sound of applause confused him at first. He had forgotten where he was, forgotten the mocking crowd, forgotten everything except the music and the memory of his grandfather's voice guiding him. He looked out at the transformed faces, at the tears, at the standing ovation. Then his eyes found Victor Harrington. The billionaire was crying. Not subtle, dignified tears. Real tears. The kind that came from somewhere deep and broken. Elijah did not understand. Why would this mean man be crying? Eleanor stepped forward and helped Elijah down from the piano bench. She knelt beside him, her elegant gown pooling on the marble floor. "Child," she whispered, "where did you learn to play like that?" "My grandpa taught me." "And what was your grandfather's name?" "Thomas. Thomas Bennett." Eleanor's breath caught. She looked up at Victor, whose tears had turned into something else entirely. Recognition, disbelief, and underneath it all, a dawning horror. Victor walked toward the piano. The crowd parted for him silently. He stopped in front of Elijah, towering over the boy, but there was no menace in his posture now. Only confusion, only need. "That song," Victor's voice cracked. "Who taught you that specific song?" "My grandpa wrote it. He said it was for someone special, a student he loved very much." Victor's legs gave out. He sank to his knees right there on the marble floor, in front of 300 guests, in front of the society he had spent decades trying to impress. None of that mattered anymore. "Her name," Victor whispered. "Did he ever tell you her name, the student?" Elijah thought for a moment. Grandpa Thomas had only mentioned her a few times, always with that sad, distant look in his eyes. He called her his little Margaret, said she played like an angel. The sound that escaped Victor Harrington was not quite human. It was the sound of a dam breaking, of 7 years of grief finally finding an exit. He covered his face with his hands and wept. The billionaire who had humiliated a child minutes ago now knelt broken on his own ballroom floor, crying for a wife he had lost, a promise he had broken, and a connection he never knew existed. Eleanor placed her hand on Victor's shoulder. "It seems life has decided to teach you that lesson after all." Elijah watched the crying man with wide, confused eyes. He did not understand what was happening, but somewhere in his young heart he felt that something important had just shifted, something that could not be undone. In the back of the ballroom, a door opened quietly. A woman in a cleaning uniform stepped through, searching frantically for her son. Sarah Thompson had heard the music from the service hallway, had heard the applause, had heard whispers about a child at the piano, her child. She pushed through the crowd, heart pounding, expecting disaster, expecting her son to be in trouble. What she found instead was Victor Harrington on his knees, weeping like a lost child himself. while her son stood watching with those big brown eyes that reminded her so much of her father, Thomas Bennett. And in that moment, Sarah knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Sarah pushed through the crowd, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cleaning uniform felt like a spotlight, marking her as someone who did not belong among these silk gowns and tailored suits. But she did not care about their stares. She needed to find her son. The whispers followed her like shadows. That is the mother. The cleaning lady. Did you see what her son just did? Sarah ignored them all. Her eyes scanned the room frantically until they landed on the scene near the piano, and what she saw made her stop cold. Victor Harrington, the man whose name she had cursed for 3 years, knelt on the marble floor like a broken statue. His shoulders shook with sobs, his hands covered his face. And standing before him, looking confused and impossibly small, was her Elijah. For a moment Sarah could not move, could not breathe, could not process what she was witnessing. The most powerful man in Connecticut, the man who had destroyed her family without a second thought, was weeping at her son's feet. "Mom!" Elijah spotted her and ran across the ballroom, his worn sneakers slapping against the polished floor. He crashed into her arms and Sarah held him tight, pressing her face into his hair, breathing in the familiar scent of her child. "Baby, are you okay? What happened? Why are you out here?" "I was looking for you," Elijah said, his voice muffled against her uniform. "You were gone too long and I got scared." Sarah pulled back to look at his face, checking for any sign of harm. "Did anyone hurt you? Did that man do something to you?" "He made me play the piano." Elijah glanced back at Victor, who still knelt on the floor. "He said he would give me $10 million if I could play. So I played Grandpa's song, the special one." Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins. "Which song, Elijah?" "The one Grandpa wrote for his student, the one he made me promise to learn perfectly." Sarah closed her eyes. Of course. Of all the songs in the world, her son had played that one, the composition her father had spoken about with such tenderness in his final years, the piece he called his greatest creation, not because of the music itself, but because of what it represented, a connection that had outlived distance, time, and even death. "Mrs. Thompson." Sarah opened her eyes to find an elderly woman standing before her, silver hair pulled back elegantly, posture that spoke of old money and older wisdom, eyes that held both kindness and deep curiosity. "I am Eleanor Whitmore," the woman said gently. "I believe we need to talk." "I have nothing to say to anyone here." Sarah's voice was harder than she intended. "I just want to take my son and leave." "I understand completely. But before you go, there is something you should know." Eleanor glanced toward Victor, who was now being helped to his feet by 2 concerned guests. "That man just experienced something that has shaken him to his very core, and I believe you may be the only person who can explain why." Before Sarah could respond, Victor approached them. His face was a mess of tears and confusion. His perfectly styled hair had fallen across his forehead. His expensive suit was wrinkled from kneeling on the floor. He looked nothing like the cold, commanding figure who had humiliated her son minutes ago. He looked human, broken, completely lost. "You are Sarah Thompson," he said, his voice hoarse from weeping. "The boy's mother." "Yes." Sarah pulled Elijah closer, positioning herself between her son and this man. "And we are leaving." "Please." The word seemed to cost Victor something precious. Perhaps his pride, perhaps more. "Please, I need to understand. Your son played a song that only one person in the world should know. A song that was written for my wife before I even met her." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She had known there was a connection. Her father had told her stories about his favorite student, the talented young woman who had married a wealthy businessman and disappeared into a life of luxury, but she had never known the name, never realized it was Victor Harrington's wife. "Your wife," Sarah repeated slowly. "Margaret." Victor's eyes widened with shock. "You know her name?" "I know more than her name." Sarah's voice trembled with emotions she had buried for 2 years. "I know that she was my father's greatest pride, that he talked about her until his final breath, that he spent years trying to find her, to reconnect with the student he had loved like a daughter." The remaining color drained from Victor's face. "Your father, Thomas Bennett." Sarah watched the name land like a physical blow. "The man who wrote that song. The man who taught your wife everything she knew about music. The man who died 2 years ago in a tiny apartment, alone and poor, while you and your wife lived in mansions and threw parties that cost more than he earned in a lifetime. Victor staggered backward as if she had struck him across the face. No, he whispered. No, that cannot be right. It is the truth. Sarah's voice grew stronger, fed by years of suppressed grief and anger. My father never stopped hoping Margaret would find him. Every time the phone rang, every time someone knocked on the door, he would light up thinking maybe it was her. Maybe she had finally come back to thank him, to see him, to remember that he existed. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she did not wipe them away. She never came. And eventually he stopped hoping. He told me that some people forget where they came from once they reach the top. He said it was not their fault, that wealth has a way of building walls around the heart. Sarah's laugh was bitter and sharp. He defended her until the very end, even when he was eating soup from a can because he could not afford real food, even when his piano sat silent because his fingers had grown too stiff to play. He never blamed her, not once. Victor's face had turned ashen. He reached out to steady himself against a nearby table, knocking over a champagne glass that shattered on the marble floor. No one moved to clean it up. Margaret tried to find him, Victor said, his voice barely audible. 15 years ago. She hired investigators, searched through every record she could find, but he had moved, left no forwarding address. We thought he might have passed away. He was alive. Sarah's words were sharp as broken glass. Living in a one-bedroom apartment 40 minutes from this mansion, tuning pianos for rich people who looked right through him like he was invisible. He was alive, and you never found him because you did not try hard enough. I did not know. Of course you did not know. You were too busy building your empire, too busy destroying families like mine to notice the people disappearing in your wake. Victor flinched as if she had slapped him. What do you mean, families like yours? Sarah felt Elijah press closer to her side, his small hand gripping her uniform. She looked down at her son, at his confused and worried face, and wondered if this was the moment to reveal everything, if this was the time to tear down the final wall between them. Eleanor stepped forward, her hand finding Sarah's arm in a gesture of support. Perhaps, the older woman said gently, this conversation should continue somewhere more private. Sarah looked around the ballroom. She had forgotten about the crowd. 300 pairs of eyes watched them like spectators at the most dramatic play of their lives, absorbing every word of this unfolding tragedy. No, Sarah shook her head firmly. If he wants to know the truth, he can hear it in front of everyone. Let them see who their host really is. Victor did not protest, did not try to silence her. He simply stood there waiting for whatever blow was coming next. 3 years ago, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. My husband Daniel owned a small construction company, Thompson Construction. It was not a big business, but it was honest. We were not rich, but we were happy. We had our home, our son, our future planned out. She paused, watching Victor's face for any sign of recognition. There was none. Of course there was none. Men like him did not remember the companies they crushed, did not track the families they destroyed. Then Harrington Holdings decided they wanted our contracts, not because they needed them, just because they could. Sarah's voice hardened. Your company launched a hostile campaign against us, underbid every project until we could not compete, spread rumors about our reliability, pressured our clients to drop us. Victor's brow furrowed. I do not handle individual acquisitions. My board manages. Your board acts in your name. Sarah cut him off. Within 6 months, Thompson Construction was bankrupt. Daniel lost everything he had spent 20 years building. His reputation, his savings, his entire sense of who he was. Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. He tried to recover, took odd jobs, applied for positions at every company he could find, but your people had blacklisted him. No one would hire a man who had lost a battle against Victor Harrington. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. The stress destroyed him. His heart gave out 1 year later. He died in our living room while our 8-year-old son watched helplessly. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Victor looked as if he might collapse. So yes, Mr. Harrington. Sarah's voice was quiet now, stripped of anger, left with only endless grief. You did not just fail to find my father. You did not just let your wife's beloved teacher die alone and forgotten. You also destroyed my husband, left my son without a father, left me working double shifts as a cleaning lady, just to afford the medication that keeps my heart beating. She placed her hand over her chest, where the familiar ache pulsed beneath her fingers. The same heart condition that killed Daniel runs in our family. The doctors say stress makes it worse. Every bill I cannot pay, every meal I skip so Elijah can eat, every night I lie awake wondering how we will survive. It all adds up, and it all traces back to you. Victor Harrington stood in the ruins of his perfect party, surrounded by the elite of Connecticut, and for the first time in decades he had absolutely nothing to say. Eleanor broke the heavy silence. "Victor." Her voice was firm but not unkind. "What are you going to do?" He looked at her with hollow, devastated eyes. "What can I do? I cannot bring back her husband. I cannot undo what happened to her father. I cannot—" "You can start by being honest." Eleanor stepped closer to him. "Not with us. With yourself. Look at this woman. Look at her child. And ask yourself if the man Margaret married would have let this happen." Victor turned to Sarah and Elijah. The boy still clung to his mother, watching the adults with wide, uncertain eyes. The same brown eyes that had looked up from the piano keys minutes ago. Thomas Bennett's eyes. Margaret's beloved teacher, living on in this small, brave child. "I broke my promise," Victor said, his voice raw and cracked. "Margaret asked me to find him, to thank him, to help him if he needed it, and I let it fall through the cracks. I told myself I would do it later, that there was always more time." He swallowed hard. Then there was no more time. Not for her, not for him, not for any of it. He took a shaky step towards Sarah. "I cannot change the past. I cannot bring back what you have lost. But I can try to make things right, however long it takes, whatever it costs." Sarah studied his face carefully, looking for the lie, looking for the angle, looking for the cold businessman who would say anything to save his precious reputation. She found only a broken man, standing in the wreckage of his own making. "Words are easy, Mr. Harrington." Her voice was tired. "My husband had words too. Dreams, plans. They did not save him. Then let me prove it with actions." "How?" Victor looked at Elijah, at the small boy with the extraordinary gift, at the grandson of the man who had shaped the love of his life. "Your father wanted Margaret to know that his music survived. She is gone now, but his music just filled this entire room. His legacy lives in your son's fingers." Victor's voice grew stronger with each word. "I swear to you on everything I have left, I will not let that legacy be forgotten. I will not let your family struggle another day." Sarah wanted to refuse, wanted to grab her son and walk out of this mansion and never look back. But then she felt Elijah tug at her sleeve. "Mom!" His small voice cut through her anger, like sunlight through clouds. "Grandpa always said the piano brings people together, even people who forgot how to listen." Sarah looked down at her son, at the boy who had inherited his grandfather's gift and his grandmother's gentle heart. The boy who somehow still believed in the goodness of the world, despite everything it had taken from him. "One chance," she said finally, turning back to Victor. "You get one chance to prove you are more than the man who destroyed us. I will not waste it." Victor's voice held a conviction that surprised even himself. "I have spent 7 years failing the people who mattered most. I am done failing." Outside the tall windows, snow had begun to fall, soft white flakes drifting down from the December sky, covering the grounds of the Harrington estate in a blanket of peaceful silence. Inside, Victor Harrington made a choice that would define the rest of his life. For the first time in 7 years, he chose to feel. The ballroom emptied slowly, like water draining from a sink. Guests gathered their coats and exchanged bewildered glances, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. The party of the year had become something none of them would ever forget, though not for the reasons Victor Harrington had intended. Within an hour, the grand space stood nearly deserted. Only a few remained. Eleanor, who refused to leave until she knew the situation was resolved, 2 security guards standing uncertainly by the main doors, and the 3 people whose lives had just collided in the most unexpected way. Victor had asked Sarah and Elijah to stay, not demanded, asked. The difference was not lost on anyone. They sat now in a smaller room off the main hall, a private study lined with books that had never been read, and photographs that told the story of a life that had stopped 7 years ago. Margaret smiled from a dozen frames, her eyes bright with the joy that had slowly faded from this house after her death. Elijah sat close to his mother on a leather sofa, his small hand clasped in hers. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the wealth that surrounded them, but always returning to the photographs of the woman he had never met. She was beautiful, he said quietly. Victor, seated across from them in a wing-back chair, followed the boy's gaze to the largest photograph. Margaret at the piano caught mid-laugh, her fingers hovering over the keys. She was everything, Victor replied, his voice rough. And I did not deserve her. Sarah said nothing. She had agreed to stay, but that did not mean she was ready to forgive. Some wounds ran too deep for a single night to heal. Eleanor entered carrying a tray with cups of tea. She had dismissed the remaining staff, insisting that this conversation required no audience. Setting the tray down, she took a seat near the window, present but not intrusive. "I have spent the last hour trying to understand how I missed it all," Victor said, staring at his hands. "How I let everything fall apart without even noticing." "You were busy counting your money," Sarah replied. There was no venom in her voice now, only exhaustion. "That is what men like you do. Men like me." Victor let out a hollow laugh. "I used to know what that meant. Successful, powerful, respected." He shook his head. "Now I am not sure it means anything at all." He looked up at Sarah, meeting her eyes for the first time since they had sat down. "Tell me about your father. Please, I need to know who he really was." Sarah hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse, to keep her father's memory protected from this man who had failed him so completely. But another part, the part that had inherited Thomas Bennett's generous heart, understood that this might be the only way forward. "He was a dreamer," she began slowly. "Always had been. When I was little, he used to tell me that music was the only language that never lied, that you could hide behind words, behind smiles, behind expensive suits." She glanced pointedly at Victor. "But you could never hide behind music. It always told the truth." Elijah nodded. "Grandpa said that to me too. He said when I played, I should always play what I felt, not what I thought people wanted to hear." "That sounds like Thomas," Eleanor said softly from her chair by the window. She had been quiet until now, but something in her voice made everyone turn. "I knew him, you know. Many years ago." Sarah's eyes widened. "You knew my father?" "I knew of him. My late husband Robert hired him to tune our piano when we first moved to Greenwich. That must have been, 30 years ago now." Eleanor smiled at the memory. "Robert was tone-deaf, could not tell a sharp from a flat to save his life, but he insisted on having a perfectly tuned piano because he loved watching me play. Thomas came to our home every few months for nearly a decade." "I never knew that," Sarah whispered. "He was a private man, proud, but not in a boastful way. The kind of pride that comes from knowing your own worth, even when the world refuses to recognize it." Eleanor's eyes glistened. "He spoke about his daughter sometimes, said you were his greatest composition." Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling down her cheeks. Elijah squeezed her other hand tighter. "The last time I saw him was perhaps 12 years ago," Eleanor continued. "He had aged considerably. Times were hard, he said, but he never complained. He mentioned that he was teaching his grandson to play." She looked at Elijah with newfound understanding. "That would have been you." "Grandpa took me everywhere," Elijah said. "Even when he got sick, he still taught me. We did not have a real piano, so he drew keys on cardboard and I practiced on that. He said the music was in my fingers, not in the instrument." Victor closed his eyes, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "Margaret used to say something similar, that Thomas taught her music was not about perfection, it was about truth." He opened his eyes, looking at Sarah. She loved him like a father. Her own parents were cold, distant, more concerned with appearances than affection. But Thomas saw her, really saw her, and he helped her find her voice through the piano. Then why did she never come back? Sarah's question hung in the air like smoke. If she loved him so much, why did she abandon him? She did not abandon him. Victor's voice cracked. "She tried to find him. I swear to you, she tried. After we married, she wanted to invite him to our home, to introduce us. But he had already moved. The building where he taught had been demolished. His phone was disconnected. It was as if he had vanished. He moved because he could not afford the rent," Sarah said flatly. "His students were all going to bigger schools, fancier teachers. No one wanted to learn from an old man in a cramped apartment when they could pay for conservatory training instead. We did not know. You did not look hard enough." Silence fell over the room. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking seconds that felt like hours. "You are right." Victor's admission was barely audible. "I did not look hard enough. Margaret was sick by then. The doctors said she had maybe a year, and I focused on finding treatments, specialists, anything that might save her. Finding Thomas became something I would do later, after she recovered. His voice broke. She never recovered. And after she died? Victor's face contorted with shame. After she died, I became someone else, someone I do not recognize anymore. I buried myself in work, because it was the only thing that did not remind me of her. Every room in this house held her memory. Every song on the radio sounded like something she might have played. The piano, he gestured vaguely toward the ballroom. I could not even look at it without falling apart. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to them. So I built walls, made deals, crushed anyone who got in my way, because if I was winning, if I was powerful, then I did not have to feel. I did not have to remember that I had failed the only person who ever truly loved me. He turned back to face Sarah. Your husband, Thompson Construction. I did not know, I swear to you, I did not know it was your family. My board brings me acquisition targets, and I approve them based on numbers, market share, profit margins. He stopped, realizing how hollow the excuse sounded. I never asked who would be hurt. I never cared. And now? Sarah's voice was steady. Do you care now? Victor looked at Elijah, who watched him with those deep brown eyes. Thomas's eyes. The eyes of a man who had shaped the woman Victor loved, who had given her music, who had given her soul a voice. And Victor had let that man die alone and forgotten. I care, he said quietly, more than I have cared about anything in 7 years. Eleanor rose from her chair and walked to Victor's side. Caring is not enough, she said, gently but firmly. You have spent years taking from this world without giving anything back. If you truly want to honor Margaret's memory, honor Thomas's legacy, you need to do more than feel sorry. You need to act. Tell me how. Victor's voice was desperate. Tell me what to do. Sarah stood, lifting Elijah with her. For a long moment, she simply looked at Victor Harrington, the man who had everything and nothing, the man who had destroyed her family without even knowing their names, the man who now stood before her stripped of his armor, asking for guidance from a cleaning lady and her 9-year-old son. You cannot buy forgiveness, she said finally. You cannot throw money at this and make it go away. If you want to make things right, you need to understand something first. Anything. My father did not want to be saved. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted to know that his music, his teaching, his love, that it meant something, that it would outlive him. Sarah placed her hand on Elijah's shoulder. My son carries that legacy now. Every note he plays is my father's voice, speaking from beyond the grave. That is worth more than any amount of money you could offer. Victor nodded slowly. Then what can I do? Sarah looked around the room at the photographs of Margaret, at the evidence of a love that had burned bright and faded too soon, at the man who had lost himself in grief and only now was finding his way back. You can start by being honest, she said. Not just with us, with everyone. The people you have hurt, the families you have destroyed, the promises you have broken. She paused. And then you can use your power for something other than yourself, not because it will make you feel better, but because it is the right thing to do. I will. Victor's voice was firm for the first time all night. I will make this right, all of it, however long it takes. Elijah tugged at his mother's hand. She looked down at him. Can I say something, Mom? Sarah nodded. Elijah stepped forward, approaching Victor with a courage that seemed impossible for someone so small. He stopped directly in front of the billionaire and looked up at him. My grandpa told me a story once, about a king who had everything but was still sad. He asked his servants to find him something that would make him happy. They brought him gold and jewels and beautiful things from all over the world. But nothing worked. Victor knelt down to be at eye level with the boy. What finally made him happy? A beggar gave him a piece of bread. The king asked why this gift was different from all the others. The beggar said it was because he had given everything he had. The gold and jewels cost the rich people nothing, but the bread was all the beggar owned. Elijah paused. Grandpa said real giving only counts when it costs you something. Victor felt something crack open in his chest, a place that had been sealed shut for 7 years. Your grandfather was the wisest man I never had the honor of meeting. He is watching right now, Elijah said with absolute certainty. He and your wife. I think they are friends up there. I think they are happy we are all talking. Victor could not speak, could barely breathe. He reached out and placed his hand on Elijah's shoulder, a mirror of the gesture Sarah had made moments before. I am going to make them proud, he whispered. "I promise you. I promise them." Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. Inside, 3 broken people began the fragile process of building something new from the wreckage of the past. It would not be easy. Trust once shattered takes years to rebuild. But for the first time in a long time, Victor Harrington believed it was possible. And that belief was worth more than all the money in the world. 6 months later, the auditorium of the Hartford Conservatory hummed with anticipation. 300 seats filled with parents, teachers, and music lovers, all waiting for the spring recital to begin. Programs rustled, cameras were positioned, whispered conversations floated through the air like leaves on a gentle wind. In the front row, Sarah Thompson sat with her hands folded in her lap. She looked different now. The dark circles under her eyes had faded. The worry lines on her forehead had softened. She wore a simple blue dress, nothing expensive, but it fit her well. For the first time in years, she looked like a woman who had remembered how to breathe. Beside her sat Victor Harrington, but anyone who had known him 6 months ago would barely recognize the man in that seat. His hair was shorter, simpler. His suit, while still well-made, lacked the aggressive sharpness of his former wardrobe. And his eyes had changed most of all. The ice had melted. Something warm lived there now. On the other side of Sarah sat Eleanor Whitmore, her silver hair pinned elegantly, a proud smile already forming on her lips. "Nervous?" Eleanor asked Sarah quietly. "Terrified," Sarah admitted with a small laugh. "He's been practicing for weeks. I hear that song in my sleep now." "Your father's song?" Sarah nodded. "He wanted to play it tonight. Said it felt right." Victor leaned forward slightly. "He's going to be wonderful. I have heard him practice. Thomas would be proud." Sarah turned to look at him. 6 months ago, she would have flinched at those words coming from his mouth. Now she simply nodded. Yes, he would be. The lights dimmed. The audience fell silent. A young woman in a black dress walked to the center of the stage and announced the first performer. The recital proceeded through a dozen students of varying ages and abilities. Some played flawlessly. Others stumbled, but recovered. All of them received warm applause and encouraging smiles. Then the announcer returned to the microphone. "Our final performer this evening is 9-year-old Elijah Thompson, playing an original composition by Thomas Bennett, titled Song for Margaret." Sarah's breath caught. She had not known Elijah had requested that specific introduction, that he had wanted his grandfather's name spoken aloud, attached to the music, preserved in the memory of everyone present. Elijah walked onto the stage. He wore a simple white shirt and dark pants, his hair neatly combed for once. He looked so small against the grand piano that dominated the stage, but his steps were steady. His chin was lifted. There was no fear in his eyes. He reached the piano and turned to face the audience. His gaze found his mother in the front row, then Victor, then Eleanor. He gave them a small nod, a private acknowledgement that this moment belonged to all of them. Then he sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. The first note rang out, pure and clear, just as it had 6 months ago in that ballroom full of strangers, but everything else was different now. There was no mockery, no cruel laughter, no challenge to prove his worth. There was only music. Elijah played with his eyes closed, just as his grandfather had taught him. The melody flowed through his fingers like water finding its path downhill, natural and inevitable. The audience sat transfixed, pulled into the story the music told without words. Sarah wept silently, tears streaming down her cheeks, not tears of sadness, tears of gratitude. Her father's music filled this room, performed by her son, witnessed by people who would carry it in their hearts long after tonight ended. Victor wept too. He did not try to hide it, did not care who saw. Let them see. Let them know that Victor Harrington had learned how to feel again. The song built to its gentle climax, notes cascading like light through stained glass, and then resolved into a final lingering chord that seemed to hang in the air even after Elijah lifted his hands from the keys. Silence. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then the audience rose as one. Applause thundering through the auditorium. Standing ovation. For a 9-year-old boy who had learned piano on a cardboard keyboard in a tiny apartment. For a grandfather who had died believing his music would be forgotten. For a legacy that refused to disappear. Elijah stood and bowed, a shy smile crossing his face. His eyes found his mother again, and this time they were shining with joy. After the recital, The three of them sat on a bench outside the conservatory. The spring evening was warm, the air sweet with the scent of blooming flowers. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "You were perfect," Sarah said, her arm around Elijah's shoulders. "Absolutely perfect." "I made a mistake in the middle part," Elijah said. "Did you hear it?" "No one heard it," Victor assured him, "and even if they did, it does not matter. Your grandfather used to say that mistakes are just the music finding its own way." Elijah looked up at him curiously. "How do you know what Grandpa used to say?" Victor smiled. "Your mother has been telling me stories, and I have been listening." It was true. Over the past 6 months, Sarah had shared countless memories of Thomas, his quirks, his wisdom, his stubborn pride, and endless patience. Victor had absorbed every story like a man dying of thirst finally given water. "Can I tell you both something?" Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age, the edges soft from handling. "I found this last week. It was in a box of my father's things that I had not opened since he died. I was not ready before, but I think I am now." She handed the envelope to Victor. "What is this?" "A letter. My father wrote it a few months before he passed. I think he knew he did not have much time left." Sarah's voice trembled slightly. "I want you to read it. Both of you." Victor opened the envelope carefully, as if it contained something precious, which of course it did. He unfolded the single page inside and began to read aloud, his voice soft. "To whoever finds this when I'm gone, my name is Thomas Bennett. I was a piano teacher, not a famous one, not a successful one by the world's standards, but I loved what I did. Every student who sat beside me at the keyboard became family for those brief hours we shared. There was one student I loved more than the rest. Her name was Margaret. She had a gift I have never seen before or since. But more than that, she had a heart that matched her talent. When she played, you could hear her soul singing. I wrote a song for her when she graduated. I called it Song for Margaret, though I never told her that was the title. I wanted her to think of it as her own, as something that belonged to her and no one else. Life separated us. She went on to marry, to build a life I was not part of. I tried to find her once, many years later. I heard she had become ill. I wanted to see her one last time, but I could not locate her. And then I heard she had passed. I wept for her, for the music we would never make together again, for the conversations we would never have. But I do not write this letter to mourn. I write it to forgive. Whoever failed to bring us back together, I forgive you. Life is complicated. People get lost in their own struggles. We forget to reach out. We assume there will always be more time. Margaret would not want me to carry bitterness. She was never bitter about anything. She saw the good in people, even when they could not see it in themselves. So I choose to remember the joy, the music, the light in her eyes when she finally mastered a difficult passage. That is the legacy I want to leave behind. My daughter Sarah has given me the greatest gift of my final years. My grandson Elijah. He has my fingers. He has my ear. But more importantly, he has my heart. The music will live on through him. I am certain of this. To whoever reads these words, do not waste time on regret. Do not let pride build walls between you and the people you love. Life is short. Music is eternal. Love is the only thing we take with us when we go. Play well. Forgive freely. Remember always. Thomas Bennett. Victor's voice broke on the final words. He sat holding the letter, tears dropping onto the aged paper. "He forgave me," Victor whispered. "Before I even knew I needed forgiveness, he forgave me." Sarah placed her hand over his. That was who he was. He never held on to anger. He said it was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to get sick. "I have heard that before," Eleanor said softly. She had been standing nearby, giving them space but unable to stay completely away. "Your father was not the first to say it, but he was one of the few who actually lived it." Elijah had been quiet through the reading, his young face thoughtful. Now he looked up at Victor. "Tio Victor?" The name still caught Victor off guard every time Elijah used it. Uncle, a title he had never expected to hold, a connection he had never expected to cherish. "Yes? The $10 million you promised that night. What happened to them?" Victor smiled. "They are in an account with your name on it, waiting for you to turn 18. Then you can decide what to do with them." "I already know what I want to do." "Tell me." Elijah stood up from the bench and walked a few steps away, looking up at the stars that now filled the sky. "Grandpa taught me on a cardboard keyboard because we could not afford a real piano. He tuned pianos for rich people all day, then came home and drew keys on cardboard for me. The boy's voice was steady, mature beyond his years. There are other kids like me. Kids who love music but cannot afford lessons, cannot afford instruments, cannot afford to dream. He turned back to face the adults. I want to find them. I want to give them what Grandpa gave me. Not just pianos, not just lessons. I want to give them someone who believes in them, someone who sees them. Sarah covered her mouth, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Victor rose and walked to Elijah. He knelt down so they were eye to eye, just as he had done that night in the ballroom. But this time there was no humiliation, no cruelty, only love. Your grandfather told you that story about the king and the beggar, Victor said quietly. Do you remember what made the bread valuable? The beggar gave everything he had. Yes, Victor nodded slowly. I spent my whole life giving from my surplus. Donations that never cost me anything, charity that never touched my heart. It was easy, and it meant nothing. He placed his hands on Elijah's shoulders. But these past 6 months, I have given things that cost me everything. My pride, my reputation, my walls. He paused. I went back to every family my company destroyed. Not all of them forgave me. Some doors were slammed in my face. But I kept going. Because your grandfather's letter was right. We do not get to choose whether people forgive us. We only get to choose whether we try. Elijah studied Victor's face with those deep brown eyes. Are you happy now, Tio Victor? The question was so simple, so direct, so impossible to answer with anything but the truth. I am learning to be, Victor said. Happiness is not something I deserve, but peace. Peace is something I'm beginning to find. He stood and looked at Sarah, then at Eleanor, then back at Elijah. Your grandfather was right about something else too. Love is the only thing we take with us. Everything else stays behind. The money, the houses, the titles. None of it matters in the end. Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object. A piano key. Ivory. Aged, slightly yellowed. This was from Margaret's first piano. The one she learned on before I bought her the Steinway. She kept it as a reminder of where she started. He handed it to Elijah. I want you to have it. Let it remind you that every master was once a beginner. Every mansion was once a foundation. Every song was once a single note. Elijah held the key carefully, reverently, as if it were made of gold. Thank you, Tio Victor. Thank you, Elijah. Victor's voice was thick with emotion, for teaching me that the true million is not in any bank. It is in the music we make together, in the forgiveness we offer freely, in the moments we share with people who matter. The four of them stood together in the spring evening, united by loss and healing, by music and forgiveness, by a song written decades ago that had somehow found its way through time to bring them together. Sarah looked up at the stars. Do you think they can see us, Dad? She whispered. You and Margaret? A warm breeze stirred the flowers nearby, carrying with it the faint scent of something sweet. And for just a moment, if you listened closely, you could almost hear music playing somewhere far away. Elijah smiled. They can see us, Mum, and they are playing together. I am sure of it. Victor put his arm around Sarah's shoulders. She leaned into him, allowing the comfort, accepting the connection that had grown between them over these months of healing. They were not a traditional family, not bound by blood or marriage certificates, but they were bound by something stronger, by choice, by forgiveness, by the music that had brought them together against all odds. And in the end, that was the only thing that truly mattered.